So, good morning all of you. Welcome to the online botany classes. Today we will discuss about membrane transport. Okay, how the different polar and non-polar molecules are transported across the plasma membrane. Okay, let us start now. You know that the movement of smaller molecules through plasma membrane takes place by passive and active transport. Passive transport and active transport. So, these are the two processes through which the smaller molecules move across the plasma membrane. Now, you know, as far as structure is plasma membrane is concerned, it is made up of phospholipid bilayer. So, out of the lipid bilayer, there is presence of a hydrophobic core. So, middle part is the hydrophobic core, which actually facilitates the entry of hydrophobic molecules through them. Okay. Plasma membrane is made up of lipid bilayer, that is very well known to you. The lipid bilayer at the center or middle of the plasma membrane is hydrophobic in nature, and this hydrophobic nature helps in the movement of hydrophobic molecules through them, that is non-polar molecules through them. Now, what about the hydrophilic molecules or the polar molecules? They can also move across the membrane with the help of transport proteins. So, the transport proteins, they help in the movement of hydrophilic or polar molecules across the membrane. Well, as far as transport proteins are concerned, these can be channels, carriers or pumps. We will discuss one by one. Now, first of all, we will discuss about passive transport. Okay. As far as passive transport is concerned, it is the simplest way in which the molecules move across the membrane or the solutes move across the membrane. Here, the movement occurs along a concentration gradient, that means from higher concentration to lower concentration. So, we can say that it is a simple process of diffusion. Okay. So, here the molecules move from higher concentration to lower concentration, that is along a concentration gradient. There is no use of energy. Energy is not required for passive transport process. Now, passive transport can take place by means of simple diffusion as well as facilitated diffusion. Okay. Simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. You know about diffusion. Diffusion is nothing but the process in which the molecules or ions of gases, liquids and solids move from their higher concentration to their lower concentration. Got it? So, this is what your diffusion is. So, as far as passive transport is concerned, it can take place through simple as well as facilitated diffusion. Let us know what simple and facilitated diffusion are. So, in case of simple diffusion, the solutes move across the biological membrane along the concentration gradient. So, here the solutes move across the biological membrane along the concentration gradient. Got it? That means from higher concentration to lower concentration, and there is no involvement of any protein carriers. Protein carriers are not involved in the process of simple diffusion. What are the molecules that move through in this process of simple diffusion? They include non-polar solutes like oxygen, carbon dioxide, CO2, NH3, etc. So, these move from higher to lower concentration. Got it? And they do not require any protein carriers. Got it? Now, come to the facilitated diffusion. Here the movement of molecules occurs through membrane spanning proteins. That means, they take the help of membrane proteins to move across the membrane. Okay. What are those? These are called carrier proteins as well as channel proteins. Okay. Carrier proteins and channel proteins. Now, the carrier proteins, they undergo conformational changes to facilitate diffusion. If the movement across the membrane is occurring through carrier proteins, they undergo conformational change. That means, change in their shape. The carrier proteins undergo change in their shape and help to bring about the facilitated diffusion. But as far as channel proteins are concerned, they only provide a passage for the movement of solutes or ions across the membrane. Okay. The channel proteins, they provide a passage for the molecules to move across the membrane, whereas carrier proteins, they undergo conformational change. That means they undergo change in their shape so that the molecules can move across the membrane. Got it? So, this is what your facilitated diffusion is. So, facilitated diffusion can take place through carrier proteins as well as channel proteins. Carrier proteins, they bring about the movement across the membrane by undergoing conformational changes, whereas channel proteins, they provide a passage through which the movement of molecules or ions takes place. Now, let us come to the next one, that is active transport. We have already discussed in the first slide that movement across the plasma membrane can take place both through passive as well as active method. In case of passive, there is no need of use of energy. It takes place along the concentration gradient, that is from higher concentration to lower concentration. But as far as active transport is concerned, it takes place against the concentration gradient, that is from lower to higher. In that case, energy will be required. Okay. So, active transport requires energy. Got it? So, what are the proteins involved in active transport called? These are called pumps. So, the carrier proteins involved in bringing about the active transport are called pumps. Got it? Now, active transport is always unidirectional. Unidirectional, that means it takes place in one direction only. Active transport is of two types. What are those? Primary active transport and secondary active transport. Got it? So, as we have already discussed in this particular slide that active transport requires energy because it has to pump the molecules or ions against the concentration gradient, and the proteins involved in the process of active transport are called pumps. Got it? Active transport are of two types, that is primary active transport and secondary active transport. Now, let us come to the primary active transport. The primary active transport utilizes ATP directly. Well, you know that active transport is itself, it requires ATP to bring about the transport of molecules. Now, there is a minor difference between primary and secondary active transport. In case of primary active transport, it directly utilizes ATP to bring about the movement of molecules across the membrane. But secondary active transport actually is dependent on primary active transport. How? It utilizes the proton concentration gradient or the ion concentration gradient formed by a primary active transport. Got it? So, primary active transport directly utilizes the ATP, but secondary active transport is dependent on primary active transport in the as it uses or utilizes the proton concentration gradient or ion concentration gradient formed by primary active transport. Now, how that happens? How the secondary active transport happens? Let us consider about mammalian intestine. Okay, mammalian intestine. Here the transport of ions takes place by active method, but how the primary and secondary active method takes place here. Okay. So, in case of mammalian intestine, there is presence of sodium potassium pump, Na plus K plus pump. Okay. What it does? It pumps out 3 Na plus out of the cytoplasm, and in return it pumps in 2 K plus. So, sodium potassium pump, it pumps out 3 Na plus out of cytoplasm and pumps in 2 K plus. 2 K plus means 2 potassium ion. Okay. As a result of which more amount of sodium concentration gradient occurs outside the cell. Got it? More amount of Na plus concentration, higher concentration of Na plus occurs outside the cell, accumulation of Na plus occurs outside the cell because you are removing 3 Na plus out of cytoplasm and taking in 2 K plus. Got it? So, this higher concentration of sodium outside the cell helps in secondary active transport. How? It pumps glucose into the intestine. Through Na plus glucose co-transporter. Got it? So, what is that co-transporter? I will discuss. So, here primary active transport is sodium potassium pump, which pumps 3Na plus out of cytoplasm and pumps in 2K plus into the cytoplasm. Now, as a result of this movement, there occurs accumulation of more amount of sodium outside the cell. So, higher sodium concentration brings about the secondary active transport. Here, the secondary active transport helps in the transport of glucose with the help of sodium glucose co-transporter. Got it? What happens? Here, one glucose molecule is transported along with 2Na plus into the intestine. So, co-transporter, that means they all of these move in one direction. One glucose molecule and 2Na plus, they move into the intestine through sodium glucose transporter, co-transporter. Got it? So, in this particular example, we can say that the sodium potassium pump is an example of primary active transport, whereas the movement of glucose into the intestine through sodium glucose co-transporter is an example of secondary active transport. So, here it is quite clear that the secondary active transport is dependent on the primary active transport of sodium potassium pump for its own movement. Got it? So, this is what your primary and secondary active transport is. It is all about the primary and secondary active transport. Now, secondary active transport can be of two types. What are those? Sympot and antiport. Okay. Sympot, that I have already discussed, that is co-transport, but that is both the ions move in same direction, co-transport. Got it? Both the ions move in same direction. Now, so sympot and antiport. Antiport means in opposite direction. So, what happens in sympot? The H plus combines with a carrier called symporter. The carrier is called symporter and combines with an anion like NO3 minus, Cl minus, etc. and move in same direction. So, if it is plasma membrane, there is presence of a symporter. Now, this H plus combines with symporter, got it? H plus combines with symporter and it also combines with NO3 minus. So, both of them move in same direction. Got it? They are moving in same direction, either into the cell or out of the cell. So, they are moving, basically they are moving in same direction. One cation, that is H plus, is combining with an anion. Okay? Now, as far as your antiport is concerned, just the opposite one. What happens? Here, it is Cl minus, okay. I have not written NO3 and Cl, it should be NO3 minus and Cl minus because these are anions. Now, as far as the antiport is concerned, the antiporter, it is a carrier, it combines with H plus on outside and a cation on inner side, positive ion on the inner side, and they move in opposite direction. Okay. If this is plasma membrane and this is outside, then this antiporter, we call it as antiporter, it combines with H plus on outside, H plus on outside, okay, then and a cation on the inner side, cation on the inner side and move in opposite direction. So, H plus is coming to in this direction, whereas the cation is moving in this direction, opposite direction. So, this is what your secondary active transport is all about. Secondary active transport is of two types, that is sympot and antiport. In case of sympot, both the ions move in same direction, H plus combines with an anion, whereas in case of antiport, the H plus combines with an antiporter and the antiporter combines with a cation, but they move in opposite direction. Got it? So, this is what your transport process or membrane transport is all about. I hope this should be beneficial for you in understanding the process of membrane transport, that is how molecules move across the membrane. Thank you very much.